Recently, visual storytelling has been emerged as an important trend in the media because they are considered more effective than any text at evoking the emotions and inspiring audience to take actions. Now, I would like to introduce our esteemed speaker to you. In fact, I have read his CV and it is a very rich of experience, and I try to summarize it. Mr. Ali Mustafa graduated from St. Louis University in 2005 from the Department of Arts in Political Science, and he pursued his master's degree from Columbia University in 2010 from the Department of Arts and Journalism. He currently works for TRT World as a correspondent from May 2015 until today. He is also an adjunct professor in Northwestern University in Qatar since January 2015. During his career, he worked as a journalist in different agencies such as Al Jazeera English, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, Dow News Networking, and CNBC Business Network. Before shifting to our respected guest, I need not to remind you, our participants, the presentation will last for 35 minutes, and I would kindly request you to mute your mics while the presentation goes on. Keep your questions until we open the question and answer session at the end. Mr. Ali, first I would like to thank you for accepting our invitation to join us and share your experience with our participants and audience. On behalf of ICYF President Mr. Taha Ayhan and ICYF Secretariat, welcome to our program, and we are confident that your presence will be as an added value to our program. Now I'll give you the floor to start. The floor and time are yours.
Thank you so much, Suhair, and hello guys. I feel very uncomfortable staring into a camera and talking to people, even though that's what I do for a living. But post-pandemic, post-corona, things are different. I was stuck in Canada. Suhair gave that wonderful introduction, and I think I'll go step by step into what my experience has been over the past 16 years as a journalist, and especially over the past 5 years as working at TRT as a reporter and sometimes as a presenter. But we're talking about a visual medium or visual storytelling. Stories are stories. And before we begin, I want to make it clear to you guys that every story, like this one, I don't have a set presentation. I'll try to, go as it comes. So if you guys have any questions, if you like to interrupt me, just unmute your mic and you can. I don't want you to be muted all the time. I want this to be an interactive thing. So when we talk about storytelling, when we talk about journalism, you guys need to be very clear. If this is what you want to do, you have to have a clear idea in what is it that you are trying to say. A story is a story. It doesn't matter if it's visual or if it's written down. Every story has a structure. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. What does that mean? Well, when you're writing a story, you have to conceptualize, you have to close your eyes and visualize and ask yourself, what is it that I'm trying to convey? What is the story that I'm trying to tell? And who will be the characters that will tell that story? So structuring a story is very, very important. A beginning, a middle, and an end. But unlike using your words in a feature story, let's say you're writing a feature story, you need to come up with something called a nut graph. Do any of you guys know what a nut graph is? Okay, a nut graph is a synthesis of your entire story in 2 or 3 lines. It's called a nut graph. That's NUTGRAPH. Remember this. A nut graph. Before you begin conceptualizing or visualizing a story, it's very important to have a nut graph in front of you, because that will determine the direction your story goes into. So for example, Google, if you're on your computers, Google Ali Mustafa, Al Jazeera. Google it. You'll come across a page and you'll come across, I think, 10 or 15 stories that I wrote while at Al Jazeera. Why are we talking about writing stories when we're talking about visual storytelling? Well, because without writing, without having the ability to put your words down on paper, you will not be able to tell any story, be it a feature, a written feature, or a visual story. I'll get to the visual side of it, but I cannot stress the importance of knowing how to structure your thoughts. And writing helps you structure your thoughts. So if you go through my stories on the Al Jazeera website, for example, you'll see that each story tries to encapsulate the entire idea of a 12 or 1300 page document feature into a few sentences at the top. And then it expands with the characters, with the sources. These are all vehicles that will assist you in telling your story. All right, feature writing is very important. Having a structure is very important. How then does that migrate to visual storytelling? Well, a lot of times when we're writing, we're trying to write things that we cannot show. But with pictures, that's completely different. When you're telling a visual story, you have to focus on two very critical things: motion, movement, hareket, as we say in Turkish, and emotion, uygun, or reaction. Emotion and motion. Emotion is when somebody, like I'm talking to you, right? Through the camera. I'm expressing myself. I'm expressing my emotions. Let's imagine a girl, a 7-year-old girl who has lost her legs in a bombing, in a Syrian regime bombing in 2013 in Aleppo. If you Google a story called "A Phoenix Rises from the Ashes of Idlib or Syria," it was a story that we did at TRT World. It starts with this character, the 7-year-old girl who has lost her legs, but she hasn't realized it as a handicap. So the story begins with this girl sitting in a one-bedroom home with the family, with her parents, her brothers and sisters, and unfolds like that. The story has emotion, it has motion, it has movement. So, and visual storytelling, if your stories have movement and if they have emotion pegged to it, then the story will sell. Then the story will have traction. Let's explain these concepts. What do we mean by motion and emotion? Well, for the past 3 or 4 years, I've been shooting a lot of my stories on this. I wish I could have bought my Mojo kit with me. So I have a tripod. I have something called a beast cage. It's BEAST cage. So the beast cage sets in my phone. I plug it in, I put it up on a tripod. Guys, I think I might have to leave this room. So you'll see some emotion in this storytelling as well as I guide you through the newsroom and into a vacant space, which my news editor says might be a vacant parking lot. So follow me. Sorry about that.
Dublin.
This is Naveed, another news editor. That's Charlie, one of our news editors at TRT World. And I'll show you guys the newsroom now. That is the boss's office. If you guys can see that, that's the newsroom of TRT World. This section is where Newsfeed sits. These are two wonderful executive producers, Mohsen Mughal, Angela Murphy.
Hi.
Hi, guys. And that's our output desk right there. Will, passing through, coming to the interviews desk. Bera, Karaman is right here. And, oh, you know what? That is also taken. So not good planning, but I think it makes this session more interesting for you guys. I'll even show you guys the studio, so you have an idea of where we are. That's the studio. You guys can see it? Good. It's funny, we were talking about motion and emotion and stories. This is, love you too. Love you too. Maria Ramos, say hello. Hello. Good. Loud. That's not the first time I've been accused of being loud, and it won't be the last time. That's my team. We just shot this show, this episode, an hour and a half ago. Merve, Nick, they're working on it. Shenez, she's a director. The next episode that we're shooting is a new show that we're doing called Decoded. And the next episode will go on air on Saturday. So first prayer is expected at Hagia Sophia on Friday, this coming Friday. I think we lucked out in how movement, emotion, showing things. This is a visual medium. You're very welcome. Love to give you guys another tour. If I'd planned this better, I would have taken you to the Bosphorus side. So this organization that I was showing you guys is TRT World. I helped start it along with 34 other people in 2015. We arrived from Al Jazeera to Istanbul. I had lived in Doha for 3.5 years. And slowly, the channel grew. We have specific areas we focus on, for example, Libya, the Middle East, Europe when it comes to Turkish issues, the Middle East when it comes to Syria, the war in Syria, what's happening in Iraq. These are the core stories that we are covering. So you need to have an idea of what story you want to tell. Who is your target audience? Who are you telling the story to? If you aren't clear about who you're speaking to, then you won't be able to tell an effective story. For example, I know I'm speaking to a lot of students, a lot of aspiring journalists, and so on and so forth. Maybe some people that are part of an NGO. They want to know how it works. And if in the past 20 or 15 minutes I've been able to tell you anything, is that unless you are emotionally involved with the story, unless you can highlight the emotional contours of a story, and unless your story has movement, even like this, it will not be able to gain traction. You need to have movement. You need to have emotional elements in your story. I was talking about the 7-year-old girl, Majda, whom we interviewed in 2015 in Gaziantep. So this girl is living without her legs. She's been given prosthetic limbs by organizations working in Gaziantep with people who have lost the ability to walk or lost an arm or a hand in barrel bomb attacks in Syria, for example. So that character, these characters are already very emotional characters. When you present these characters to the world, they will elicit an emotional response. But this comes with a very big responsibility as well. Because if you're telling the story of someone who has been affected by war, who's lost an arm, a leg, or parents, or brothers, or sisters in war, then you need to be aware of where the red line, so to speak, is. Where does telling the story of a person who has suffered stop? And where does it then go to being, let's say, maybe exploitation? A lot of people are in this business or do this job for exploitative purposes. There's something called war tourism, where people go into war zones like Libya, like Syria, like Iraq, to get a rush, essentially. Oh, and we've got our head of digital media for TRT, Arabic and World, Mr. Yusuf Ozan, who's walking by, just gave them a tour. They kicked me out of meeting room. I hope you don't mind.
No, it's okay. As you can see, I'm all alone here during the lockdown.
Thank you so much. Anything you'd like to say to our to the people who are listening from ICYMA?
I just would like to thank you all
And come visit us at TRT World. Thanks, Yusuf. So these things are very important, and maybe there's no structure to it. Every story comes with its merits, but if you can identify certain things that are common in these stories, then you will have something. For example, we already spoke about stories having motion and ICYMA. My bad, sorry. Kareem, thank you for that, Kareem Kabari. So we already spoke about stories having movement and emotion. These are things that are common, right? Like, for example, Ali Mustafa walking, giving you guys a tour of TRT world, you meeting these interesting characters. Some of these characters you might be tied in, but there are other things that we can focus on as a whole, as a theory. For example, when we talk about a refugee crisis, there will be certain things that will be common in a refugee crisis in, let's say, Syria or Iraq or Pakistan, right? Our job is to identify what these things might be. For example, refugee camps, right? Visually, when you think about refugees or a refugee story visually, when you visualize it, you think of refugee camps, you think of children running around, you think of really poor health conditions, maybe waterlogging. So these are commonalities which will help you tell your story. I'm going to a refugee camp. Okay, I have to focus on the children. How are the children being taken care of? Are they being educated? And these consistencies will remain either in Syria, Iraq, or in Pakistan, right? How is the state interacting with the refugees? Is the state helping these refugees? If so, how so? These are things that will be consistent. These questions will be consistent in Syria, Turkey, Pakistan, Iraq, right? So the Turkish response will be to give ration cards or 120 liras in a Halk Bank card, which the Turkish government funds, for example, in collaboration with the World Food Programme. That's the Turkish experience. What is the Pakistani experience? Well, Pakistan doesn't have that much money. So a lot of the burden then falls on the United Nations. So if you have these consistent ideas, if you can identify consistent markers in a story, you can tell that story easily. We're talking about refugees. You can talk about protests. For example, what do the protests in Tahrir Square in 2013 have in common with the BLM, Black Lives Matter protests in the United States in 2020, right? They're both episodes of something called contentious politics. Contentious politics is when individuals or groups within a state start making claims of the state. When it comes to BLM, it's end police brutality, more civil rights, and so on and so forth. In the Egyptian context is end to military rule or end to military dictatorship. Both of these things are claims that individuals or groups are making of the state. How the state responds to these claims is how a movement shapes up. For example, if the state response is violent, is illiberal, the movement will become violent and illiberal. If the state response is open to negotiation, the movement will become more peaceful, as in its demands will be peacefully met. So we need to understand these blocks, these block concepts, which go beyond just circumstances, right? Oh, protests in Egypt. What does it matter? If you know the context in which protests are taking place, in which contention is taking place, in which refugees, why do refugees leave or are forced to leave their place or where they reside? It could be because of environmental challenges, like in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. It could be due to war, like in Syria, for example. It could be because of multiple reasons. But if you have those basic conceptions, regardless of a particular situation, you can plug in any situation in that. I want to tell a story, for example, of a refugee camp in Iraq, or internally displaced IDP camp in Iraq. If you Google Ali Mustafa Iraq TRT world, something will come up. And as I'm telling you these stories, I will encourage you to search for these stories as well. So for example, the case of Asia Bibi, and basically a woman, a Christian woman in Pakistan who was accused of blasphemy in 2010 by a group of women who didn't like her apparently, and a case was registered against her and she was sentenced to death. Blasphemy in Pakistan either going against the Quran or the Prophet, the Islamic Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is a very contentious issue, right? How do you tell that story in a balance? Or is the idea of visual storytelling contrary to objectivity or balance? I would like to tell you, you know what? If you are telling a story, if you're pointing your camera, if you're pointing your phone, or if you're pointing your laptop at a story, then you're already biased towards it, right? As soon as I turn my camera on and focus on a character, I'm showing my bias towards that story. My job then as a storyteller is to keep on contradicting my own biases. What does that mean? Keep on contradicting your own biases. In that situation, my own bias is that Asia Bibi was falsely accused, and then she was, under the law of that country, she was condemned to death, right? That's my bias. But what's the other side of that story? The other side of that story is that Asia Bibi broke the law, allegedly broke the law, and she went against the sentiments of millions of Pakistanis who believed that she was guilty. The court comes out and says, okay, this woman is guilty, but then the court reverses their decision. That leads to counterclaims, mass protest demonstrations on the streets of Pakistan. So if you Google Asia Bibi verdict, Pakistan, Ali Mustafa, you'll know how that story is told. And sometimes in visual storytelling, the story is coming in different parts. Some parts will focus on the reaction of the protesters or extremists that are against Asia Bibi being freed. Some parts of the story will focus on people who say that Asia Bibi suffered enough, that people who died defending her, like Salman Taseer, the former governor of Pakistan's largest province, were in the right. So it's always giving these sides to the story. Does that make the story more objective? I think objectivity is something that is always fleeting. You need to know in your mind, in that nut graph, what is the story I want to tell? And then the pictures will start coming to your mind. Okay, this is the story of a woman who faced injustice, who was wrongfully accused, and there was a backlash against this woman. And the people who were leading the backlash say they were doing so because of this reason, because there is a law in Pakistan which condemns people to death if they are convicted of blasphemy. It's a British era law. So context, it's so complicated, right? I make it sound so complicated. These ideas of contentious politics, BLM, protests, refugees, but was walking through the TRT World offices, was that complex? We're at a building, we're at a newsroom, somebody comes in, the story begins with me starting this conversation with you, then it gets interrupted, I have to react, I pick up the laptop, I move out. So the story has a sequence. It's going on from point 1 to point 2 to point 3, and then finally concluding. We are following a narrative arc. A beginning, a middle, and an end. If you start visualizing stories in this way, it'll excite you. It'll excite your viewers. You have to take your viewers on a journey. What that journey is comes down to you. Maybe your journey is biased. Maybe it's not biased. Maybe you're not even invested in your journey. So, if you want to be visual storytellers, you have to be invested in the stories you want to tell. Because if you are not invested in the stories you want to tell, the people on the other side of the screen will not be invested in these stories either. That makes sense? Cool. I think we have 5 more minutes, but I'd like to open it up because my throat is drying up. But this is fascinating. I did have a presentation actually talking about all these things, and maybe I can share it with you later. But I've been on the go for the past 5 months. I left Turkey on the 9th of March for New Zealand to cover the first anniversary of the Christchurch attacks. Once I got to Christchurch, the flights back to Turkey got cancelled, so I couldn't fly back. So then my boss, Erman Yüksel, who's my line manager, he said, you know what, you've got family in Canada, why don't you go there? So I flew to Canada and I was stuck there for 4 months. While in Canada, they asked me to work, but all I had was my phone. I had left my Mojo kit, my mobile journalism kit. They give us a tripod, something to attach the phone to, a mic. I left it in Istanbul because I was planning on returning back on the 18th of March. So I ordered a new kit. I ordered a Manfrotto tripod. I ordered a beast cage, and I ordered a Rode mic with a top Lude light. And I'll send you guys the kit list as well. If you haven't already invested in something like this, I would advise you to do it because it'll free you up. You don't need a $5,000 camera or $10,000 camera. You can use your phone. This is good enough. If your shots are stable, if your framing is set, it could be better. I could lift this up and that would be a better framing for me, right? Instead of having down there. But these are things that you have to think about. When you place your phone on the tripod, what is the angle? What is the framing? Is the light on you? All these things also come in with movement. You're talking about movement, but why are you telling us to take static shots? Static shots are your backup. For example, I can be walking around Istanbul. If I have a 5 to 10 second clips of static shots, I can paint over my walk. Just put it on there and it'll tell a story in itself. Visually, mentally, making sequences in your mind. For example, there's a guy sitting here talking to a screen. How would I put this scene in a shot? I'll have a long shot, maybe from somewhere there. Then I'll have a close-up, maybe of my face or the side of my face. Then I'll focus on the screen. And then maybe I'll have a shot on the other side, looking at me directly. I'll have 5 or 6 shots that I can paint over this conversation. Just because I'm thinking visually, I'm visualizing what is coming to my mind. Okay, they want me to do a story on militias fighting in Libya. How does that story begin? Well, it begins with war. If I'm there, if I'm on the front line, go Google Libya Ali Mustafa TRT world. And you'll see, okay, this guy's there. How does the story begin? There's firing, fighting going on everywhere. Take a breath, pull yourself back, close your eyes and visualize. Okay, firing, trucks moving around, I'm in a truck. That's the story. Where is that truck taking me? It's taking me to an abandoned building by the old Tripoli airport. All right, what's going on there? It's a lookout. They're looking at Khalifa Haftar's forces on the other side who are firing at them. So visualizing the story in your mind, in those moments is very, very important. Once you visualize a story, you will bring movement to it. You can extract emotion from your characters. And that's what visual storytelling at the end of the day is, or any storytelling for that matter. If you don't have the structure, you can even bring emotion and motion in the words you write. If you have an idea of what you want to say. And now it's time for a Q&A according to Mariam Abdul Razak from Oman. Open it up, guys.
So, Mariam, you can go with your question.
Oh, first of all, thank you so much. I hope I wasn't blabbering on too much. No questions?
Actually, we thank you for this spontaneous and interactive lecture. And we were interested to visit the TRT World Studio and for making this virtual tour for us. And I can expect that this lecture shall go with this flow, because to be a journalist, you have to be or own the characteristic of being spontaneous and interactive. Now I will take the questions one by one and direct them to you, Mr. Ali. I have a question from Saad Chanda from Pakistan. The
Cool.
floor is yours.
Hi, Saad.
Hi, sir. How are you?
Not bad. Good to see you. Yes, yes, I can hear you.
Okay. So I have two questions. My first question is that, in your opinion, what an ideal 5-minute story contains? Should there be a lot of statistics, opinion, or visuals related to that story? So that was my first question. And my second question is a little personal, but thanks to ICYF for providing me this opportunity. Sir, you are an alumni of Columbia School of Journalism, and I am really looking forward to take admission there for my graduate studies. So any tip for me and my fellow participants to secure a good fellowship for one of the renowned institutions like Columbia School of Journalism?
Both good questions. Every story is different, right? Every story has different elements. Some 5-minute stories will be statistic or data heavy. That means you'll have to incorporate. Some 5-minute stories might be people heavy. The ideal story is one which will take numbers and combine them with personal stories. For example, 5,000 people have been diagnosed with the coronavirus in XYZ. This is one person that was diagnosed but has since recovered. So any story that matches or can combine data with human or a human interest will be a successful story. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, it doesn't matter. You have to bring in the human angle. Numbers by themselves don't mean anything unless there is a human being or an issue attached to it. Why do we care about numbers? Who gives a shit about numbers? Unless it applies to something. So your job as a storyteller will be to take these hard to understand numbers, statistics, and apply them to the human condition. For example, there are 65% of Karachi's population lives in shanty towns. XYZ, Iqbal Muhammad, is one of those people. And then his story begins. Or his story begins with the character, and then you get into the numbers. So you can play around. There is no set format. Going back to Columbia, I got into Columbia on scholarship in the MA Politics program, half of which was at the journalism school, and half of it was at SEPA. And by that time, I was very clear. I'd spent 4 months in Afghanistan writing my undergraduate thesis. I had worked in Pakistan for 4.5 years as a journalist. I was very lucky to be involved with the launch of Pakistan's first English news channel, Dawn News, with Pakistan's second business news channel, CNBC Pakistan. So by that time, I was very clear that this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. If you are not clear about this, and this is a very difficult profession, it's dying off, it's changing drastically. Visual storytelling is changing drastically. Now you don't need a cameraman, you don't need a kit. You can do whatever you want yourself. You have to be clear in what you want to do. You have to put down your ideas in where you see yourself now, 5 years from now, and 10 years from now on paper. And if you can commit to this profession, which I don't know will be possible moving forward because the profession will change. When I went to Columbia 10 years ago, journalism was a very different thing. To visual storytelling was a very different thing. When I shot a documentary, my graduate thesis at Columbia was a 26-minute documentary that I shot over 6 months. I shot 25 interviews of Hussain Haqqani, Malia Lodhi, Mark Siegel, James Rubin, you name it. I had everyone. But when it came to crafting the story, it wasn't what I wanted. Even then, after putting it so much effort, it was like a disappointment. It's still a great piece. It was called The Deal Undone, Pakistan, its Army, and the Americans. That was my graduate thesis. But you have to be committed. You have to be passionate. If you're not passionate about this, forget about it. Leave it. Honest to God advice, even if you are passionate about it, be very, very aware of the challenges that exist. Being brown is a challenge. Speaking, because it comes down to power dynamics. This medium, the visual medium, is a construct of power, of projecting power. And analytics show that if you have a white female talking to you, you would trust her the most. Then you have a white person talking to you, you would trust him the second. Then a brown person, and so on and so forth, a black person at the end. So these are Orientalist constructs that are already exist. We are fighting in a system that was created by powers that are in the West. How do we use that system? How do we use this for our own benefit? Well, we have to learn. We have to get these ideas in our heads. How do you tell a story? Who am I telling a story to? Who is this story challenging? TRT is challenging, or Al Jazeera started off challenging the constructs of the West. I would also advise you to start reading Edward Said. If you want to understand how power works in media, read Edward Said. Start by reading him. These things are very important. You have to know your place. Edward Said, I'll write it down for you guys.
You can write it in the chat box if you can.
He's dead now. Okay, Edward Said, can you see that? S-A-I-D, Edward, E-D-W-A-R-D, S-A-I-D. I'll write it in the chat box as well. Google him, read Orientalism, Internet Connection is Stable. I think I've said too much.
There's someone from participants who have already write it down in the chat box.
Okay, let me go to the chat box if I can. Okay, and also start reading Charles Tilley. And Charles Tilley and Edward Said were fighting each other because Charles Tilley was a Zionist. He was a historian, a political historian. And Edward Said, they both were at Columbia University, by the way. And they both took on each other because Edward Said was saying, you know what? Zionism is wrong. It needs to end. All these things are Orientalist tropes through which they see us. Tilley's point of view was very different because he was a believer in something called capital and coercion in the formation of states. And if you look at capital and coercion as a basis of state formation, then Israel fits into a perfect example. But this is an example that denies millions of Palestinians their rights. So there are different things at work. You have to read, you have to understand what's going on, what's happening, why is it happening? And yeah, all right, go on, guys. Your passion is very contagious. I read both of them, me too. Yeah, passion can also kill you guys, so be careful. If this is what you want to sign up for, be very sure.
Okay, let's go for the following question from Ahmed Abidi from Ethiopia. The floor is yours.
Go ahead, Ahmed.
Can you hear me, please?
Yes, I can hear you, Ahmed.
Thank you. That was very, impressive. Thank you for taking us to the studio. It was really lovely to see different parts of the studio departments. So I have one question, and that is, as a TV presenter, what was the most unusual interruption or disruption that you came across right in front of the camera? That's crazy, but if you can recall any of that, thanks.
You know what? I've been doing this for 16 years, and I think one reason I have been able to do it so long is because I have a very good ability to forget. Okay. Anything that affects me. For example, I went to Libya, Tripoli, in December last year. And it's interesting you say this because a lot of times what you see on camera is only like a slither of the tensions in the background. So me and my cameraman flew into Misrata because Mitiga airport in Tripoli had been attacked. My cameraman was a guy called Swad Fazlic, and Swad had lived in Sarajevo during the Bosnian siege. So we got to Misrata, we're driving to Tripoli, we passed through, we've got a fixer, Muat Mustafa, 24 years old, and we are driving through a patch which was controlled by Gaddafi loyalists. Zipping through, he's like, bro, just keep your head down and pray. We got there, we got to Tripoli, and went to the Radisson Blu Hotel. And as soon as we check in, we start hearing boom, 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 after every 30 seconds to 40 seconds. It got so bad that my cameraman called up my boss. He's like, I want to leave this place right now. My boss called me up. He's like, what the hell is going on? I'm like, bro, there's like bombing going on 8 kilometers outside. And because Tripoli is shaped like a cove, that means the desert comes in, the voice carries from 8 kilometers in all the way into the cove that Tripoli is basically. So my boss is like, why the hell is he having these issues right now? So I went and spoke to Swad. I'm like, bro, we have to stay. We can't go. He's like, this is reminding me of the Sarajevo siege. If Haftar's forces encircle Tripoli, then there's no way to escape. Now, I don't want to keep someone there who doesn't want to be there. So my boss is like, okay, we'll book a flight for both of you and you guys can leave. On the day of the flight, 2 hours before the flight, my boss, Erman, calls me up. He's like, can you stay back? I'm like, dude, I don't have a cameraman. What do you want me to do? He's like, bro, find a cameraman. Just do what you need to do. I was like, okay. And this is Tuesday. We arrived on Sunday. Swad leaves. Through one of our contacts at TRT, we find a cameraman, this Jordanian guy who was married to a Libyan woman, had lived under Gaddafi. And we end up going to the front lines. So imagine you have to suppress a lot of your natural reasoning, right? You have to be a little out of your mind. So Swad made the right call. He left. I stayed back. In my mind, I'm like, dude, if I die here, there's nobody coming to get me.
Yeah, I believe that I can believe that this will be as a great discounted in your career history.
Well, credit or not, we got the job done. But going back to it, things can happen on the field like this. There can be bullets flying. Nothing is more important than your life. We tell ourselves this lie. If you're in this profession, if you are committed to this profession, sometimes we make the mistake of putting the work before ourselves. I'm married, I have a wife, I have 2 kids. But if you keep on doing this, this becomes your life as well. And it's very hard to detach. And when you're always on an adrenaline rush, that means you're always chasing the next story, you become addicted to it. And a lot of people then lose their balance as a result of it. They become miserable if they're not getting their fix. So you have a lot of correspondents that go into wars that can't live without it. We have some even in our organization. But finding that balance, what is it that you want to do? Is this what you want to do? Are these the stories that you want to tell? Not every story has to be a life or death decision. Most stories are not. But what's the value in it? That's very important. And that's what you guys need to understand as visual storytellers. Go on, next question.
Okay, Mr. Ali, I have a written question from Miriam Saud from Algeria. She has a technical issue with her mic, but she wrote down the question. She said, how do we deal with government censorship? Let's say you cover a story that you publish and that might include certain angles or information that the government doesn't like. What can you do in a position like this?
Well, I think this is a very, very important question. And I also think it deserves some context. This is the 3rd government organization that I have worked for. I worked for CBC Radio Canada, which was controlled by the Canadian government or funded by the Crown. I worked for Al Jazeera English, which is funded by the Qatari state. And I work for TRT World. Now, all these organizations have something called a style guide. A style guide is like your Bible, is like your Quran. You cannot divest from it, right? But you can find new ways of saying the same story. For example, for Turkey, in our style guide, the PKK is a terrorist group, right? The HDP is linked to the PKK. I know this, but when I say something about the PKK, I will always attribute it to the PKK, which Turkey, the European Union, and the United States consider a terrorist organization. I would like you guys to go search for Google Diyarbakir referendum or elections Straight talk. Let me write it. Diyar Bakr. Straight talk. A referendum, I think. If you want to see how we have covered sensitive stories, the PKK is a red line in this country. The HDP is a red line in this country, but we have covered this story in this country. Every story can be covered. Any story can be covered. You can either do a good job at it or you can do a bad job at it, right? We will always have angles. Al Jazeera will always have an angle. When I was working there, the Yemen issue was picking up. And Al Jazeera was going hard. Muhammad Wal was going hard at the Houthis. Everything short of the Houthis committing genocide. But the Houthis weren't the only ones killing people. But Al Jazeera was pushing that agenda. Syria war. There are two sides to it. There's Bashar al-Assad and there's the 5 million civilians in opposition-held Turkish-backed areas. How do you justify that story? From a balance point of view, maybe there isn't a balance in that story. Maybe Bashar al-Assad is a killer, right? Does that make me a journalist or propagandist? Well, I have to make a I have to be very careful in the words that I use, in how I frame the story. And that goes back to the question that our friend posted from Algeria, Miriam. How do you deal with government censorship? Let's say you cover a story that you publish that might not include certain angles or information that the government doesn't like. If you have a conception in your mind, at TRT, I'm not going to be doing stories glorifying the PKK. That's a given, right? But I can try to tell a story where the PKK is a character, where somebody has been affected by the PKK or by the government, and that character is driving my story. If I can identify those characters, find those characters, I don't have to censor myself. Those characters will tell the story for me. So finding voices that can articulate things that you might not be able to, but at the same time, your network or your place of work will have its own biases. Even an organization like the CBC is extremely pro-Israel, and that's in a democracy. Turkey is a democracy. It has its red lines. Try doing a pro-Saudi Arabia story on Al Jazeera. That's a given. So certain things are given as per the style guide, but you can still find ways of telling very sensitive stories in a unique way, in a way that people will understand the issue and might even then empathize with what you are trying to achieve. I hope that answers the question. It was a difficult question. Follow the style guide, know what organization you're working for, what are their red lines, and then once you know what their red lines are, you can navigate through the minefield if there is. And there are a lot of minefields.
Okay, thank you. Next question from Abdi Noor Aidan from Kenya.
Shukran, Suhair Hanim. Ali, I've had the opportunity to interact with you as a viewer on Twitter, but today this is another great one on this online session. So I would like to know, how do you manage to maintain that cheerfulness and the emotions in different topics? You know, watching you during the Christchurch, the reports, the live down the line interviews, and maybe what advice will you like to leave it with young journalists who are new in their career or even haven't had a similar experience and privilege as yours? Thank you.
Well, my enthusiasm, in all honesty, could be the result of undiagnosed ADHD as a child. But I don't know. I never went to a psychiatrist or psychologist. So, you know, it might be. But it takes a certain kind of person to do this kind of job. And if you can't laugh about it because it's so stressful as it is, and if you're not invested in a story, if you don't care about it, don't do it. But if you do care about it, then you have to find a way to express it. You mentioned Christchurch, 51 people killed, right, at 2 mosques in the sleepy little town of 340,000 people with 3,500 Muslims. Okay, as I'm visualizing that story, I will find the tone for that story, right? My passion can be there, my enthusiasm can be there, but my tone will be different. Tonality, how we convey a story, and at the same time trying to maintain our enthusiasm for it, is something that comes with experience. It's been 16 years since I've been doing this job. Maybe my enthusiasm has increased in some ways, maybe it has waned in a lot of others. But this is something that you will have to find yourself. What is that story that you care about? The Christchurch attack story fits into our narrative as TRT, right? Because you've got the global South narrative. Any story in which Muslims are persecuted or are a minority that is dealing with hardships anywhere in the world is a TRT world story. And we came up with this idea, with this template. We worked hard to say that, you know what? If Muslims are being targeted in Germany, if mosques are being attacked, that is a story that TRT will take ownership of. Kashmir is a story that TRT World will take ownership of. These are stories that we have to be enthusiastic about because we care about these issues. I don't care about all issues. For example, I don't care what's happening in South Africa maybe, or in Ecuador, but I do care about what's happening in this region, why TRT World was built. Does that make sense? Or maybe it was all over the place. Apologize.
Okay, next question from Sidra Ahmed from India.
Sidra Ahmed.
Hello, can you hear
Hello,
me?
Sidra. Yes, I can hear you, Sidra.
Yes.
Oh, okay. I just want to ask, when you were saying when we speak about characters with emotions, when we are telling their stories, it's our responsibility not to cross the line and not to exploit them. So what do you mean by crossing the line? Can't we just just tell the narrative altogether? Or is there something which we can't? Because as a journalist, we have to tell the whole story, right? So what is the red line?
There are many red lines. Human beings are emotional, right? We have emotions. I'll go back to Christchurch. When we got to Christchurch, I had no contacts, nothing. Got to the mosque, met someone who connected me to someone else. By the 5th interview, I was sitting with Khushbu Vora, originally from India, and her baby. And her husband had died in the attacks, and the baby was like 7 days old. And I started crying. I was an emotional wreck. I called my wife up. I was like, I can't do this. And she's like, why are you getting so emotionally involved in the story? Why are you crossing that line? I was like, dude, how else am I supposed to tell that story without feeling what they're feeling? And that's the slippery slope. That's the red line. If you are too invested in the story, it'll kill you. But how do you tell a story without being too invested in it? That's the challenge. And that's maybe the lesson of experience. I don't know. But for example, I have sympathies for the Taliban, right? And I have an interview with the Taliban spokesman. But because I like the Taliban spokesman, I might not ask him certain questions. That's a red line. I might have sympathies from the Taliban, but it is my duty to ask that man or that person, have you changed your ways? Do you still have the same ideas about women education as you did? These are questions that are my responsibility. If I don't ask these questions, I'm crossing a red line. Or sometimes, for example, maybe, one of my colleagues went to Afghanistan to interview Ashraf Ghani. And she didn't ask him a basic question. And when I asked her, why didn't you ask him this question? She said, oh, I was invited by them. I couldn't have asked him that question. It is your job. You are going there, sitting in front of someone to ask him that specific question. You crossed all the red lines without asking that question. So the red line comes down to your ability to contradict yourself, to challenge yourself, to ask that tough questions, to ask the Pakistani Interior Minister, why has the state succumbed to extremists, right? Or to ask the extremists, well, the Prophet Muhammad, who you say you are defending, said, forgive people, but you want to kill them. These are things in that moment. Search for Pakistan extremist rally, Ali Mustafa. I'm sitting in the back of a truck with lights on it, like Mad Max style, with 8,000 people running with their babies after this caravan, on which is a guy called Khadim Hussain Rizvi sitting. And it's like people with completely like engrossed because they've just won against the government and they're making their way back. And I'm sitting there on the truck and I ask him, well, the Prophet said you should forgive. Then why do you want to kill? And he goes, the Prophet never said to forgive. The Prophet said, if this is done, then this is the punishment. Okay, but that's how you get the story out. That's what you need to do to get the story out. You need to keep challenging yourself. You need to keep challenging your own biases. And that's how you get the answers. So the red lines keep on shifting. Sometimes going too far ahead, being too emotionally involved with the victims is crossing a red line. Sometimes not asking a question is crossing a red line. Sometimes asking a question is crossing a red line. So the lines will keep changing. You will have to determine what is a red line given that particular context or situation. And that will only come with experience, with time.
Next question from Yasser Ahmed Jamaluddin. The floor is yours.
Best session so far. That gives me hope.
Yes, I have been going through all the comments. They were so enthusiastic with listening to you, Mr. Ali, and so I do.
Thank you so much.
I guess he lost the connection. Let's take Karim Kabari from Egypt.
Karim Kabari.
That's me. Okay. Hello, Mr. Ali.
Hi, Karim. How are you, brother?
I'm good. How are you?
Not bad. Go ahead, please.
Are we getting to the point that there will be no standards for the storytelling? Since we are all talking about the attractive way, will it be just that since I have the aim of the story and the right attractive channel, that's it? There will be no standard for the story as long as I can deliver it and people can get it?
What are the kind of stories that you like to watch?
Speaking generally.
Well, but there must be some stories that you like to watch, right? Visual stories that you like to consume. Maybe you like the AJ Plus style. Maybe you like the BBC style. So there are certain styles of storytelling that you have a preference for, right?
Yes. So I mean, like the style is yes. I mean, there's a standard and the style. So when we are still learning at the beginning, we go to the technique or the standards, and after that, everyone work according to their own style. So are we getting the point that it will be only based on the style and not sticking to standards or techniques anymore?
Okay, maybe I think I need to pull back and give some context. When we are talking about storytelling or visual storytelling for our purposes, we're always talking about fact-driven stories. Stories where you are showing and telling the reality as you see it. Talking to people, right? Visual storytelling, I'm talking to someone. That's the context. The standards have to be determined by you. Without a standard, without having sourcing, for example, or without the entire purpose of this session is that when you are telling fact-based stories, have these things in mind. The standard is already set. You're not going to be fabricating anything. You're not going to be paying people to come in front of the camera, right?
Yes.
So these standards are already there. If you are paying someone to come on camera, then it's not fact-driven.
Yes.
Right? So,
yes, right.
So maybe we need to clarify. I do a job where the company has a certain angle. It has a certain purpose, like Al Jazeera, like CBC. My job is to take the facts as I see them and show those facts to a wider audience through visual storytelling. That is a stylistic choice. But the standards are already set. I'm not going to deviate or manipulate what I'm trying to show. I might not have the biggest picture to show at that point in time, but my attempt will be to show them as much unfiltered as I possibly can. That is the standard. That's a given. Fact-driven storytelling is a given. You can't escape it. Unless you're making a drama or a mini series, I don't know, or infotainment. That's different. So the standards are already set. Now, if you want to manipulate those, then you are deviating from the standards. For our intents and purposes, everything that I've spoken about has to do with fact-driven storytelling. You can have fiction storytelling. Go on.
So the standards are related to, like, for example, talking about, of course, we have the facts, I've talked about the news, but if we'll talk about the, let's say, for example, the camera angles, the lighting, the backgrounds, all the things. And as you can see, every day, people are coming with different ideas when filming or telling stories, and some of them are, you know, just audio stories or visual stories. So these are the kind of standards, or let's say, maybe steps or we are following.
Okay, all right. For example, you always shoot a story with light on it, right?
Yes.
If I was to go here, I'm against the light. My face is dark. You can't, the light is blurred.
Like a silhouette or something.
That's a given. That's a standard. You'll always have a mic on and make sure you have the best audio. Your framing needs to be right. And these are obviously, that's another section. I'll get my tripod, I'll get my equipment, I'll show you guys how to do it if you are interested. But this is an assumption, right? I'm assuming you guys already know lighting is important, be mic'd up, have a nice frame. Digital storytelling, analytics at Al Jazeera AJ Plus show that if people were looking straight into the camera, there would be more engagement. But now they're saying, no, you don't have to necessarily look straight into the camera. What we were doing previously with an angled shot does the same thing. So the standards can keep on changing as long as it's connecting with you. It doesn't necessarily matter. As long as you can see my face, as long as you can hear my audio, there will be movement. Of course, when I'm moving the camera, I'm picking it up. What's the standard? Light goes, light comes, but you are following me. I'm engaging with you. So these standards, styles can change as long as I can engage, as long as I can elicit some movement, some emotion. That's why focus on these things. How you go about telling it, you'll figure that out.
Yes.
As I was saying, I don't need a $50,000 ENG kit anymore to go live. I use this to go live on a tripod. Make sense?
Yes. Thank you so much.
I hope. Thank you, Kareem. Good question.
Yeah.
Mr. Ali, for time limitation, we will take the last two questions. One is written from, let me check her name. Let's take Junaid Rafiq, then I will read the question that is written down.
Okay,
Junaid,
sure.
the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are. You are.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mr. Ali Mustafa, for your amazing presentation and demonstrative skills you have shown. So I have basically two questions. One is like, how to draw a line when we're seeing violence all over? Since I come from Kashmir and there was recently an event when an elderly man was shot and his grandson was put on his body and that was pictured. So as a journalist, I'm supposed to cover it up. But as a person, I feel like this pornographic kind of violence I'm showing, I just want to conceal it. So where do I draw the line? This is my first question. And my second question comes to, like, when we talk about social media, when you are like emphasizing on having a phone in your hand, so you're going to be like global anytime, anywhere with these limited kind of resources you have. So as a journalist, my space is being encroached, is being hijacked by a citizen journalist. So where do I survive in this kind of, what would you suggest for that? Thank you so much.
Well, it's very brave of you. I don't know if you're from Indian administered Kashmir or not, but it's very brave of you to come on.
There. Thank you so much for acknowledging.
Well, you're a brave man, Junaid, and these are all very good questions. It'll be very difficult for me to tell you anything in this context because you are already living in a place which is highly censored, where access to information is limited, depending on if you are subscribing to the Indian state's narrative or not. You mentioned the old man or the 3-year-old boy on the old man's body, and then a picture of an Indian soldier taking him on his arm, and the Indian narrative. So at the end of the day, I'll put an idea in your head. Maybe this is a right idea, or maybe it might be a completely wrong idea. Media today is a war of narratives. Indian media, Republic TV, TRT World, opposite ends of the spectrum. Al Jazeera, Al Arabiya, opposite ends of the spectrum. In this war, and the sooner we understand that we are in a contest of narratives, the better we will be able to sharpen our own narrative, our own point of view, right? With all that is limited, despite all the attempts of the Indian government to censor that picture, the narrative did come out. Eventually, right, Junaid? So that's the power of social media. And if it wasn't for citizen journalists or the liberalization of this, then you wouldn't even have that. You wouldn't even have those pictures. So it's a slippery slope. It's a very tricky subject. Going back to what I was saying, journalism, media, visual storytelling will not be as it is now in the next 5 years, as it wasn't what it is now 5 years ago. So it'll keep on changing. There'll be even more disruption. So if you are looking to make money from what you are doing, you will need to come up with new ways of understanding what is content consumption, content dissemination. These are things that I think we will need to focus on. And if we put it in the context of a contest of narratives, then the best model will win. So our responsibility then is to come up with a platform, is to come up with an idea where our narrative is more sustainable. It can be monetized, content coming in, content going out. What is the repurposing of that content that is taking place? Is it a content hub idea where most of the content is coming in, you're repurposing it according to your narrative and then pushing it out? What are you pushing it out on? Do you have your own platforms like AJ Plus, like whatever? So these are things where the next contention in this will take place. Forget about citizen journalism for a second. That is here to stay. What we have to figure out is how do we use content as it is emerging, as it is being generated on this, and repurpose it for our purpose. How does that fit into our narrative? Because if content is key in the future, right? Content is everything, let's say, but there's no way to monetize it, then you have to find ways of making it more accessible, monetizing it through repurposing it, value addition to it. This is a longer conversation, but I'm glad you raised it. And think about the idea of a content hub where content from Kashmir is coming in and you are trying to verify that content. You know where it's coming from. You've got your sources. How do you then push it out or present it onto a content stream? That'll be the challenge. I hope that makes sense, Junaid. But yeah, good question.
Okay, I have a written question from Isneria Salim from Philippines. I hope I did pronounce her name correctly. She said, you have talked about Orientalism and how certain, most especially Western, narrative is highlighted in the mainstream media. What is your advice to aspiring journalists and media enthusiasts in advocating and amplifying the narratives of the people in the Orient in the mainstream media?
That's a brilliant question. That is an amazing question. And I don't think I can give any answers to that. So read Edward Said's Orientalism. Read Edward Said's Orientalism. Before anything, you need to conceptualize who you are. Who am I? My name is Ali Mustafa. I'm a brown man who's a journalist working for the Turkish public broadcaster. I've got all this experience, I've got some education, and this is who I am. In my mind, okay, this is where I stand. A person who is seeing me in the West is seeing me, or he's a brown man with a Muslim sounding name. What am I going to learn from him? Unless that person is inclined towards it. when we talk about faces that we see on screen that are representative of who we are, what our ideas are. TRT World is a product like that. It will not appeal to everyone. It's not going to appeal to the Emiratis, the Saudis, the Egyptians. It might appeal to some Egyptians. It might appeal to some in the global South, right? So having a niche, knowing who you are is very important before you can tell stories of others, because eventually you want to tell stories that are relevant to you. So a big part of Orientalism, of looking through the viewing glass, is to tell someone, my story is important. I'm a white man, I'm a white network, and this is my power, right? How do we flip that around? We flip it around by realizing, okay, I'm a brown man. I know a lot of other brown people, and they also have stories that they want to tell. Will those stories have traction in a global marketplace? I don't know. But then I have to create a marketplace for those stories. Like Pakistan is the most streamed TRT World destination in the world after the United States is Pakistan. Do you guys know that? So unless we come up with these structures, we cannot challenge Orientalism effectively. We have to know who we are. We have to know what we are trying to say. Only then will we be able to challenge things that we think are unjust or incorrect. The portrayal of Pakistan, the portrayal of Muslims, all these things, they're all part of a power dynamic in how the world sees you, how you see yourself, and then what is told on CNN, on Al Jazeera, on BBC, on TRT. This is what you need to understand. And I think Orientalism, or understanding this idea of the other. Who is the other? Anyone who is not white is the other, right? In the global conception. Or in the Indian conception, anyone who doesn't subscribe to the Indian state is a terrorist. That's also an Orientalist play. It's not only about black or white, or brown or black. It's who has power, who doesn't have power, and who doesn't have power, how will he raise his or her voice to get that power? That's what Orientalism is. It's a power play.
Actually, Mr. Ali, I was going to end the session, but there is a participant who insists to ask a question. If you all allow me to take this
Sure.
as a
Please,
final
please.
question. Okay,
Please, go ahead.
Osman Ibrahim from Ghana, please go ahead with your question.
And follow me on Twitter, guys.
Thank you very much.
Follow me on Twitter.
Sure, Mr. Ali.
Mustafa.
I just followed you on Twitter. By the way.
Excellent, Osman.
Yeah, thank you very much. You made mention of adding emotions to stories. So I wanted to know how much emotions should we add to a story? Because the very moment we start adding emotions, it might lead to exaggeration or maybe over exaggerating a story. So how much emotion should we add to a story? Thank you very much.
I'll correct you. I never said add emotions to a story. I said you have to bring out the emotions already present in a story. Every story will be, not every story will be emotional, but the characters that are telling the story will have a story to tell. You can either frame that story as they want to tell it, right? Straight up. So you have to find characters who can emotionally tell that story. I'm not telling you to fabricate anything. I'm telling you to listen, see, be aware. Okay, you know what? There's a guy standing there. Let's say my story is on a car repair workshop in Taksim. I go there. How do I make a car repair workshop into an emotional story? I find a character. There's a 12-year-old kid that works there who came from Syria. He has 5 siblings. So the car repair shop story actually begins with the story of a 12-year-old Syrian child. And he becomes your vehicle into the emotional aspects of that story. You're not adding anything. You're adding a character to the story. The character will bring out the emotions. You don't have to add anything. A good story will tell itself. You point the camera, you get the shot, you have the movement, the character has the emotions. Your job is to convey those emotions through the medium. That's what I was saying. Don't add emotions. Don't fabricate, please. I hope that answered your question, Usman.
Inshallah.
Sure.
Thank you,
Thank you very much.
Thank
As
you, guys.
said, Mr. Ali, you say that there is, whenever there is a start, there is an end. We reached the end of this session and we were very, very enthusiastic. And thank you very much on behalf of me and all the participants. And I have read all the comments that were written by the participants. Thank you for your time, dedicating your time and energy to deliver your lecture and for attracting very, very powerful the audience. Thank you very much and see you inshallah in person when you arrive to Turkey or to Istanbul specifically.
I'm already there, but when you guys come here, please let me know. It was an honor and a pleasure. But think about these things, guys. Think about these things that I mentioned. And if you guys need more notes or anything, reach out to me.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Ali. Thank you very much, our participants. See you, inshallah, in their upcoming sessions for the program. Assalamu alaikum.
Take care, guys. Bye-bye. Khuda Hafiz.